My mom wants me to forgive the man who assaulted me and let him go near me and my child unsupervised. But what happened after I trusted her again nearly destroyed my life for a second time. Welcome back to her family revenge. If you enjoy emotional family stories filled with betrayal, shocking twists, and powerful revenge, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. I was 16 years old when my life changed forever. Until then, I thought my biggest problems were school assignments, friendships, and figuring out what I wanted to do after graduation. I never imagined that one terrible night would split my life into two completely different chapters. There was the girl I used to be before that night, and then there was the girl I became afterward. The worst part wasn't even what happened to me. The worst part was discovering who would stand beside me and who would turn their back on me when I needed them most. The man responsible was Jack. He wasn't some stranger lurking in a dark alley. He was someone my family knew well. In fact, my mother absolutely adored him. Jack came from one of the most respected families in town. His mother was successful, influential, and happened to be my mother's boss. People talked about their family as if they were perfect. They donated to charities, attended every community event, and had a reputation that seemed untouchable. Because of that reputation, when I finally gathered the courage to tell my mother what Jack had done to me, she looked at me as if I had lost my mind. At first, she refused to believe me. She insisted there had to be some misunderstanding. She told me Jack would never do something like that. Every time I tried to explain what happened, she became more defensive. Looking back now, I think she was terrified. Not terrified for me. Terrified of what would happen if the truth came out. Terrified of upsetting her boss. Terrified of losing her job. Terrified of damaging her standing in the community. Somehow, protecting her reputation seemed more important than protecting her daughter. But I refused to stay silent. Even though my mother begged me to let it go, I reported everything to the authorities. The moment I did, my life at home became unbearable. Every conversation turned into an argument. Every meal became a battle. My mother treated me like I was the problem, like I was the one causing trouble, like I was the one destroying our family. The house no longer felt safe, and eventually the tension became too much to handle. Thankfully, there was one person who never doubted me, my boyfriend, the man who would later become my husband. When things became impossible at home, his family opened their doors to me without hesitation. They gave me a place to stay, a place where I wasn't constantly questioned or blamed. For the first time in months, I felt like someone actually believed me. For a little while, I thought maybe things would start getting better. I couldn't have been more wrong. A few months after moving in with my boyfriend's family, I discovered I was pregnant. I still remember staring at the test in complete disbelief. My hands shook so badly I nearly dropped it. Deep down, I already knew the truth. My boyfriend wasn't the father. We had never been intimate. There was only one possible explanation, and accepting it felt like being hit by a truck. The reality was devastating. I was carrying a child created from the worst experience of my life. I felt terrified, confused, and completely overwhelmed. Some nights I cried until I couldn't breathe. Other nights I simply stared at the ceiling, wondering how I was supposed to survive what was coming next. While I struggled to process everything, the legal case continued moving forward. Every phone call made my stomach twist into knots. Every update from investigators filled me with anxiety. The months dragged on until eventually the trial arrived. I remember sitting there feeling physically sick as I waited for the outcome. Then something happened that shocked everyone in the courtroom. Jack admitted what he had done. For years afterward, people would try to rewrite history. They would make excuses for him. They would pretend there wasn't enough evidence. But the truth was simple. He admitted it. He knew exactly what he had done. Despite that confession, he avoided prison by accepting a plea agreement. Hearing that decision felt like another punch to the stomach. The man who had shattered my life wasn't going to spend a single day behind bars. The only meaningful restriction placed on him was that he would never have the right to see the child who would eventually be born. At the time, that small protection felt like the only victory I had left. Months later, my daughter Emma came into the world. The moment I held her in my arms, something changed inside me. For so long, fear had controlled every part of my life. But when I looked at her tiny face, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. No matter what happened, I would protect her. I would never allow anyone to hurt her. Not Jack, not his family, not anyone. Ironically, the day Emma was born was also the day my mother suddenly decided she wanted to repair our relationship. She arrived with tears in her eyes and apologies on her lips. She admitted she had been wrong. She said she wanted another chance. She begged me to forgive her. Something about it felt strange, but she was still my mother. A part of me desperately wanted to believe she had changed. I wanted to believe that people could learn from their mistakes. Against my better judgment, I decided to give her another chance. For a while, it seemed like I had made the right choice. I had no idea that the biggest betrayal of my life was still waiting for me. For the first year after Emma was born, everything seemed almost perfect. My mother was everything I had hoped she would be. She apologized repeatedly for not believing me. She cooked dinners for us, helped with Emma whenever I needed a break, and acted like the loving grandmother I always wished she could be. Slowly, my walls began to come down. The anger I had carried for so long started to fade, replaced by cautious hope. Maybe she truly regretted what she had done. Maybe people really could change, then life moved forward. I was accepted into a college a few hours away from home. It felt like a chance to build a future for myself and for Emma. Since my mother had retired early, she offered to watch Emma during the week while I attended classes. I would stay on campus Monday through Friday and return home every weekend. It wasn't an easy arrangement, but it seemed practical. More importantly, I trusted my mother again. After everything she'd done to earn back my confidence, I genuinely believed Emma was safe with her. For nearly a year, nothing happened. Everything appeared normal. Then one winter storm changed everything. It was a Thursday afternoon when the weather turned ugly. Snow fell harder than anyone expected, and the university canceled classes for both Thursday and Friday. Most students celebrated the unexpected break. I decided to surprise my mother and Emma by coming home early. Looking back now, I sometimes think fate was trying to show me the truth before it was too late. The roads were difficult to drive on, but after several hours I finally pulled into the driveway. The house looked peaceful from the outside. Nothing seemed unusual. I remember smiling as I walked toward the front door, already imagining Emma running into my arms when she saw me. The moment I stepped inside, my entire world shattered. Sitting in the kitchen were 3 people. My mother, Jack's mother. And Jack, for a second, I honestly thought I was hallucinating. My brain refused to process what my eyes were seeing. Then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Jack was holding Emma, my daughter, the little girl he was never supposed to see, the child the court had specifically protected from him. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. I rushed across the room and snatched Emma out of his arms. She immediately started crying, frightened by the panic in my voice. Everyone in the room looked shocked. Apparently, they hadn't expected me home until the weekend. "What is he doing here?" I screamed. Nobody answered. My mother looked terrified. Jack's mother looked nervous. And Jack just stood there staring at me. The silence made me even angrier. I carried Emma upstairs and started throwing her clothes into a suitcase. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely zip the bag. My mother followed me from room to room, crying and begging me to calm down. She kept repeating that it wasn't what it looked like. The problem was that it looked exactly like what it was. She had secretly allowed the man who assaulted me to spend time with my daughter. The daughter created because of what he had done. The betrayal was so massive that I could barely breathe. As I packed, both my mother and Jack's mother followed me around the house, pleading with me not to leave. They claimed Jack had changed. They claimed he only wanted to see that Emma was healthy and happy. They claimed I was overreacting. Overreacting, the word nearly made me laugh. The man who destroyed my life was standing in my mother's kitchen holding my child, and somehow I was the problem. When I finally finished packing, I carried Emma downstairs and headed for the front door. I was done listening, I was done arguing, I was done trusting people who clearly didn't deserve it. Then something happened that made my skin crawl. As I walked past him, Jack grabbed my arm. Not hard enough to leave a bruise, just hard enough to stop me. The second his hand touched me, every horrible memory came rushing back. "You should be nicer to your mother," he said quietly. For a moment I couldn't even speak. The audacity was unbelievable. The same man who had destroyed my childhood was now lecturing me about kindness. I pulled my arm away and stared directly into his eyes. Then I walked out the door without saying another word. That was the last day my mother ever saw Emma. For weeks afterward, my phone never stopped ringing. My mother called hundreds of times. She left voicemails crying, apologizing, begging me to come back. Some messages lasted only a few seconds. Others went on for several minutes. I never answered a single one. Instead, I moved into an apartment with my husband and daughter. We hired childcare and completely rebuilt our lives without my mother. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought she had finally learned that some betrayals can't be undone. I was wrong. 1 week after I left, something happened that made absolutely no sense. I checked my bank account one morning and nearly dropped my phone. More than $100,000 had been deposited into my account. I stared at the screen in disbelief. The money came from my mother. No explanation, no warning, no message, just money. It felt less like an apology and more like an attempt to buy forgiveness, as if she believed there was a price for betraying her own daughter, as if money could erase what she'd done. I never touched a single dollar of it because deep down, I knew something important. Anyone willing to secretly invite Jack back into our lives wasn't finished causing damage, and unfortunately I was right. Years later, after a decade of silence, my mother would reach out again, and what she said next would prove that she had never truly changed at all. 10 years passed before I spoke to my mother again. A decade is a long time. Long enough for wounds to scar over. Long enough for a child to grow up. Long enough for people to convince themselves that the past no longer matters. But some betrayals don't disappear with time, they simply wait. The only reason I saw my mother again was because my younger sister got married. Avoiding her at the wedding was impossible. We were both there, surrounded by family members who desperately wanted everyone to pretend that everything was normal. For most of the evening, we stayed on opposite sides of the room, but eventually she approached me. The moment she saw me, tears filled her eyes. She asked about Emma, who she hadn't seen in 10 years. She asked about my son, Tyler. She asked about my current pregnancy. Then she started talking about how much she regretted the past and how badly she wanted to repair our relationship before it was too late. According to her, she wanted to know her grandchildren before she died. She even claimed something that immediately made my stomach turn. She said she had always believed me. Always. The statement was so ridiculous that I almost laughed. For years she had defended Jack. For years she had ignored what happened. For years she had chosen her reputation over her daughter. And now she wanted me to believe she had secretly been on my side the entire time. When I asked why she never stood up for me, her answer made me sick. She said she didn't want to lose her job. That was it. That was the reason. My pain, my trauma, everything I suffered had apparently been worth sacrificing to protect a paycheck. The conversation only got worse when I asked if she still spoke to Jack's mother. She admitted they still spent time together, mostly at church, she said, as if that somehow made it better. I ended the conversation shortly afterward and went home furious. Not only had my mother allowed Jack near Emma years earlier, but she was still maintaining a friendship with the woman who had spent years spreading lies about me around town. Jack's mother had told anyone who would listen that I was a liar. She claimed nothing bad had happened and that I had invented the entire story because I regretted being with her son. Those lies followed me for years, and my mother had stayed friends with her anyway. That night, I couldn't sleep. Anger kept me awake. I kept replaying every word of the conversation in my head. Part of me wanted to cut her off forever. Another part wondered if maybe after all these years, there was still a chance to move forward. By morning, I made a decision. For the first time in 10 years, I called my mother. At first, the conversation went surprisingly well. We talked about our lives. We talked about family. We talked about ordinary things. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe we were finally making progress. Then the conversation turned toward church, and church eventually led to Jack. The second his name came up, my mood changed. I told her I didn't want to talk about him. She ignored me. Instead, she started telling me how much Emma looked like his other children, as if I would somehow care. As if comparing my daughter to the man who assaulted me was normal conversation. I asked her again to stop. She continued. Then she told me something that shattered any remaining hope I had. She said Jack was a better man now. She said he felt terrible about what happened. She said enough time had passed, and then she said the words that finally broke me. You should be over it by now. For several seconds, I couldn't even speak. My entire body went cold. She had absolutely no idea what I had endured. The truth was that my mother had never listened to my side of the story. Not once. Everything she believed came from Jack, everything. So for the first time in my life, I told her exactly what happened. I told her every detail, every fear, every nightmare, every consequence. I told her what it felt like to be 16 years old and realize your own mother didn't believe you. I told her what it felt like carrying Emma while the entire town judged me. I told her what it felt like watching the man responsible walk free. And I told her exactly what I thought about her continuing to defend him. When I finished speaking, there was complete silence on the phone. Then I made something very clear. I told her never to call me again. I told her our relationship would remain exactly as it had been for the last 10 years. And I told her she would never be around my children because I could never trust her. Not after everything she had done. Not after everything she had allowed. I hung up. My hands were shaking so badly I nearly dropped the phone. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, trying to calm down. My husband immediately noticed something was wrong. He closed his laptop and looked at me with concern. He didn't need to ask. He already knew. I sat down across from him and told him everything. The conversation, the comments about Jack, the comparison to his other children, the suggestion that I should simply get over what happened. As I spoke, I could feel the anger building again. I stood up and started pacing the kitchen. I needed to move. I needed to do something. That's when the doorbell rang. The sound instantly made me freeze. We weren't expecting anyone. My husband walked to the front door while I remained in the kitchen. A few moments later, he returned carrying a small package. There was nobody there, he said. The box was addressed to Emma. There was no return address, no sender information, nothing. A strange feeling settled in my stomach. The package was wrapped in bright pink paper with a decorative bow. At first glance, It looked like an innocent gift for a young girl, but something felt wrong, very wrong. I grabbed a knife and carefully opened the box. Inside was a silver necklace with a heart-shaped pendant. Alongside, it was a small handwritten note. The message was only a few words long. For Emma, from someone who cares. The second I read it, a chill ran down my spine because deep down I already knew. This wasn't a random gift, someone had found us. And I was terrified that I already knew exactly who it was. The moment I read the note, a feeling of dread settled deep in my chest. I couldn't explain it, but every instinct I had as a mother told me that this wasn't an innocent gift. My husband saw the expression on my face and immediately understood something was wrong. Without saying a word, I handed him the note. His jaw tightened as he read it. Neither of us wanted to say the name out loud, but we were thinking the same thing. We threw the necklace and the note into the trash and agreed not to tell Emma anything about it. She was still young, and the last thing we wanted was to drag her into problems she couldn't understand. We convinced ourselves it was probably a one-time incident. Unfortunately, we couldn't have been more wrong. Over the next few days, more packages started arriving. One contained a bracelet, another contained a children's book about family history. Then came a photo album with blank pages waiting to be filled. Every single item arrived anonymously. Every single package was addressed to Emma. We threw them all away before she ever saw them, but with each delivery, my anxiety grew. Whoever was sending them knew where we lived. They knew Emma's name. They wanted her attention. That realization alone was enough to keep me awake at night. Then things became even more disturbing. One afternoon, Emma came home from school looking unusually excited. While I was making dinner, she walked into the kitchen and casually announced that she had made a new friend online. At first, I didn't think much of it. Kids talk to people online all the time. But something in her tone made me ask a few questions. She told me his name was Sebastian and said he knew a lot about our family history. She explained that he had told her stories about relatives she had never met and details about her grandmother's life that she found fascinating. The knife nearly slipped from my hand as I listened. A cold fear spread through my body. Trying to stay calm, I asked if I could see the messages. Emma handed me her phone without hesitation. The more I scrolled through the conversation, the worse I felt. The messages were polite, friendly, and carefully written, but they contained information that should have been impossible for a stranger to know. There were details about my mother's old job, the town where I grew up, and family members I had never once mentioned to Emma. Whoever was behind the account had access to information that only someone close to our family would possess. I immediately told Emma to block the account. She looked confused and hurt, insisting that Sebastian had been nice to her, but I didn't take any chances. She blocked him, and I hugged her tightly, trying to hide how terrified I really was. That evening, I called my mother. The moment she answered, I got straight to the point. I asked if she had given anyone information about Emma. At first, she denied knowing what I was talking about, but the hesitation in her voice was impossible to miss. When I told her about the gifts and the online messages, there was a long silence. Then she asked a question that made my blood run cold. She wanted to know if Emma liked the gifts. For a moment, neither of us spoke. My mother realized she had just exposed herself. She knew about the gifts. She knew exactly what was happening. When I demanded an explanation, she admitted she thought it might help if Emma slowly got to know him through small gestures. Him. She didn't even have to say Jack's name. I hung up before she could finish speaking. From that moment forward, my husband and I treated everything as a potential threat. We changed passwords, tightened privacy settings, and became hyper-vigilant about every aspect of our lives. Weeks later, my fears were confirmed. During one of Emma's school concerts, I spotted a familiar figure standing near the back of the auditorium. The second I saw him, my stomach dropped. It was Jack. He wasn't close enough to violate any restrictions, but he was there, watching, waiting, observing my daughter from a distance. My husband immediately went after him, but by the time he reached the area, Jack had disappeared. After that, the sightings became more frequent. I would see him near Emma's soccer games, school events, and even public places where we happened to be shopping. He never approached us directly. He never crossed a line obvious enough for police intervention. Instead, he stayed just far enough away to avoid consequences while making sure I knew he was there. It was psychological warfare. He wanted me to feel watched. He wanted me to feel powerless. And unfortunately, it was working. The situation finally reached a breaking point when Emma came home from school crying. Rumors had started spreading among students. Some children were telling her that her mother was a liar. Others claimed I had ruined an innocent man's life. The stories were almost identical to the lies Jack's family had spread years earlier. That was when I realized this wasn't just about seeing Emma. Jack wasn't trying to reconnect with a daughter. He was trying to rewrite history. He was trying to paint himself as the victim while turning me into the villain. That same week, legal papers arrived at our house. Jack and my mother had joined forces and filed a petition claiming I was preventing Emma from having access to her biological family. Reading those documents felt like being punched in the chest. My own mother had chosen him again. After everything that had happened, after all the years of pain and betrayal, she was still standing beside the man who had destroyed my life. Sitting at my kitchen table with those papers in my hands, I finally understood something I should have realized years ago. My mother was never going to change, and this time I wasn't just fighting for myself, I was fighting for my daughter. What I didn't know was that the battle was only beginning, and the nightmare Jack was about to unleash would be far worse than anything we had experienced before. The legal battle that followed consumed every part of our lives. What started as a petition quickly turned into a full-scale attack on my family. Jack and my mother weren't simply asking for access to Emma anymore. They were building a case designed to make me look unstable, unreasonable, and unfit. Every decision I made as a parent was suddenly being questioned. Every boundary I set was portrayed as cruelty. It felt as if the people who had hurt me most were now trying to rewrite reality itself. My husband and I immediately hired an attorney and began gathering evidence. Every anonymous package, every suspicious sighting, every online message sent to Emma was documented. We created folders filled with screenshots, photographs, dates, and timelines. At first, I worried that nobody would believe us. After all, Jack had spent years building an image of himself as a respectable family man, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. His sudden interest in Emma wasn't about love or fatherhood. It was about control. The harassment became more aggressive with each passing week. One afternoon, Emma came home from school visibly upset. Some students had been whispering about her all day. A few of them even approached her directly and asked whether her mother had lied about a man years ago. Hearing those words nearly made me sick. Those children hadn't invented those rumors themselves. Someone had planted them. Someone was intentionally spreading poison through the community. Watching my daughter suffer because of lies from my past filled me with a rage I could barely control. Determined to protect her, I scheduled a meeting with the school principal and several teachers. Sitting in that conference room felt surreal. I found myself explaining pieces of my past to complete strangers because I needed them to understand the danger surrounding my daughter. To my surprise, one of the teachers shared information that immediately raised alarms. A man had recently visited the school claiming to be a family friend. He asked questions about Emma, her schedule, and upcoming school events. Thankfully, staff members refused to provide any information, but the fact that someone was trying to gather details about my daughter was terrifying. From that point forward, the school increased security measures and promised to contact me immediately if anyone suspicious appeared again. But while the school was taking precautions, something else was happening behind the scenes. Jack was carefully positioning himself as the victim. Through church groups, mutual acquaintances, and community connections, stories began circulating about how he had changed. People talked about his volunteer work, his family life, and his supposed redemption. The narrative being pushed was simple. He had made mistakes when he was young, but now he deserved forgiveness. The more I heard those stories, the more frightened I became. Not because I believed them, but because I knew how persuasive they could be to people who didn't know the truth. Jack wasn't trying to convince me. He was trying to convince everyone else. And unfortunately, some people were starting to listen. Thankfully, not everyone was fooled. Over the years, my husband and I had built strong relationships within our neighborhood. We had friends who knew our family well. We had neighbors who had watched Emma grow up. Rather than allowing rumors to spread unchecked, I decided to be proactive. I organized a gathering at a local park and invited trusted friends and community members. Standing in front of those people was one of the hardest things I had ever done. I didn't share every painful detail of my past, but I explained enough for them to understand that someone dangerous was attempting to insert himself into my daughter's life. The response overwhelmed me. Instead of judgment, I received support. Parents offered to help monitor school activities. Neighbors volunteered to keep an eye on our house. Several families promised they would immediately report any suspicious behavior. For the first time in months, I felt less alone, but Jack wasn't finished. A few weeks later, another disturbing development emerged. Emma came home talking about a new counselor at school. At first, I didn't think much of it. Schools hired new staff all the time. But as Emma casually described their conversations, something felt off. The counselor seemed unusually interested in our family. He asked questions about relatives, family relationships, and whether Emma ever felt like she was missing important people in her life. The questions sounded innocent on the surface, but my instincts immediately told me otherwise. And unfortunately, those instincts were about to prove correct. The more Emma talked about the new school counselor, the more uneasy I became. At first, I tried convincing myself that I was being overly protective. After everything our family had been through, maybe I was simply seeing danger everywhere. But every conversation Emma described made my concerns grow stronger. The counselor, Mr. McCathan, seemed oddly fascinated by our family situation. He repeatedly asked Emma whether she ever felt curious about relatives she didn't know, whether she wished she had a bigger extended family, and whether she thought her mother was sometimes too protective. Individually, the questions sounded harmless. Together, they felt like something much darker. I decided to visit the school myself. When I met Mr. McCathan, he appeared professional, polite, and highly educated. On paper, there was nothing suspicious about him. His credentials checked out. His references appeared legitimate. The school administration spoke highly of him. Yet something about the way he looked at me made my skin crawl. It wasn't anything obvious. It was simply a feeling deep in my gut that told me this man was not who he claimed to be. Over the next several weeks, the pressure on our family intensified. Anonymous complaints were filed against my husband at work. Someone repeatedly attempted to access our financial accounts. False reports were submitted to various agencies claiming there were problems inside our home. Every accusation was eventually proven false, but that didn't stop the stress. We found ourselves constantly defending our family against attacks coming from every direction. It felt as if someone was deliberately trying to exhaust us. Then the harassment spread beyond our household. Families who had publicly supported us started experiencing problems of their own. Mrs. Jones, one of our closest neighbors and one of Emma's best friend's mothers, became the target of a vicious smear campaign. Anonymous emails containing manipulated photographs were sent to her husband's employer. Rumors spread throughout the community. Other parents who had stood beside us reported receiving strange phone calls, false complaints, and online harassment. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Someone was targeting anyone who refused to support Jack's version of events. The guilt nearly crushed me. These people had done nothing wrong. Their only mistake was standing by my family when we needed help. Yet now they were paying the price. Some neighbors quietly pulled away, unwilling to risk becoming the next target. Others remained loyal despite the pressure. Their support meant everything to us, but watching innocent people suffer because of Jack's obsession was heartbreaking. Meanwhile, Emma began mentioning more interactions with Mr. McCathan. The counselor's questions were becoming increasingly personal. He often asked about our home life and encouraged Emma to think about what she called missing family connections. The language sounded carefully crafted, almost rehearsed. It wasn't difficult to see what he was trying to do. He wanted Emma questioning the boundaries we had established. He wanted her wondering whether she had been unfairly kept away from people she deserved to know. When I requested that Emma be assigned to a different counselor, the school administration pushed back. They insisted there was no reason to make a change. Mr. McCathan had an excellent record. Other students loved him. Without concrete evidence of misconduct, they weren't willing to take action. I left the meeting feeling frustrated and powerless. Then an unexpected phone call changed everything. The woman introduced herself as Sarah. She claimed to be Jack's ex-wife and asked to meet me urgently. At first I was skeptical. It sounded too strange to be true, but something in her voice convinced me to listen. We agreed to meet at a coffee shop the following afternoon. When Sarah arrived, she looked exhausted. The moment she sat down, I realized I was looking at someone who understood exactly what I had been living through. She didn't waste time with small talk. Instead, she began telling me about her marriage to Jack. As she spoke, a horrifying picture emerged. According to Sarah, the man who had spent years terrorizing my family had done similar things to others before. She described manipulation, stalking, intimidation, legal harassment, and calculated attempts to destroy the lives of anyone who challenged him. Then she handed me a thick folder. Inside was years' worth of documentation, police reports, court filings, photographs, witness statements, DMAs, tailed timelines, everything. As I flipped through the pages, I felt my stomach tighten. Many of the tactics Sarah described were identical to what we were experiencing. Anonymous gifts, online manipulation, character assassination, strategic use of legal systems, carefully planned psychological pressure. It was like reading a blueprint for our own nightmare. The most shocking part was that Sarah wasn't the only victim. There were others, women from different states, families who had experienced the same pattern of harassment. People whose lives had been turned upside down because they refused to give Jack what he wanted. Armed with this information, we returned to law enforcement. This time, things were different. What had previously looked like isolated incidents now appeared to be part of a much larger pattern. Investigators began taking a far more serious interest in Jack's activities. For the first time in a long while, I felt a small sense of hope. Unfortunately, hope didn't last long. A few days later, I woke up in the middle of the night after hearing an unusual noise. Everything seemed quiet at first. Then I decided to check on Emma. When I entered her room, my heart nearly stopped. Her bedroom window was open. Cold air drifted into the room. The curtains moved gently in the darkness. Emma was still asleep in her bed, but someone had been there. On her desk sat a single photograph, a photograph of Jack holding a baby. Written across the back were 7 words that made my blood run cold. "She looks just like you did." I stood frozen in the darkness, staring at that message while terror washed over me, because at that moment, I realized something horrifying. This was no longer harassment. This was no longer stalking. Someone had entered my home, and the nightmare was about to become far more dangerous than any of us had imagined. The arrest should have brought peace, but life rarely works that way. Even after Jack was taken into custody, the damage he had caused continued to ripple through our lives. Lawyers contacted us weekly. Investigators uncovered hidden storage drives filled with photographs, notes, and years of surveillance records. Some files dated back more than a decade. There were names of women from different states, addresses, schedules, details about their children, and plans he had written in meticulous detail. Every discovery made me realize how close we had come to losing everything. Yet for the first time, the fear that had ruled my life began to loosen its grip. Emma returned to focusing on school, friends, and rehearsals. Tyler threw himself into baseball and spent most evenings covered in dirt and grass stains. My husband and I slowly stopped checking every window before bed. We still carried the scars, but we were finally learning how to live instead of merely survive. Months later, the trial began. The courtroom was packed with reporters, victims, and families who had been affected by Jack's actions. When I walked in and saw him sitting at the defense table, older and thinner than I remembered, I felt something unexpected. It wasn't fear, it wasn't even anger, it was disappointment. For years, I had imagined this man as some unstoppable force controlling our lives from the shadows. Now he looked small, human, weak. One by one, victims testified. Sarah spoke about how he had destroyed her marriage and stalked her across state lines. The woman from Arizona described the endless gifts and threats. Others shared stories that sounded terrifyingly similar to mine. The pattern was impossible to ignore. By the time it was my turn to take the stand, the jury had already heard enough to understand exactly who Jack was. I told them everything. Not just what he had done to me when I was 16, but every year of harassment that followed. Every sleepless night, every panic attack. Every moment my children lost because one man refused to let us live in peace. The most powerful moment came unexpectedly. Emma's written statement was read aloud to the court. The room fell silent as her words echoed through the chamber. She wrote that family was not determined by blood, but by love and protection. She wrote that the only father she had ever known was the man who tucked her into bed every night and stood beside her through every difficult moment. She wrote that no stranger had the right to claim her simply because of biology. When the statement ended, several jurors were visibly emotional. Even the judge paused before continuing. I glanced toward Jack for the first time during the reading and saw something I had never seen before. He looked defeated, not because of the evidence, not because of the charges. He looked defeated because he finally understood that despite all his efforts, Emma had never belonged to him. After weeks of testimony, evidence, and arguments, the jury left to deliberate. The wait felt endless. Every survivor sat together in the hallway, united by experiences none of us had asked for. When the jury finally returned, my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. The foreperson stood and delivered the verdict. Guilty on every major charge. A wave of relief swept through the room. Some victims cried openly. Others simply closed their eyes and exhaled years of pain. Jack showed no emotion as the judge scheduled sentencing. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, I felt something I thought I had lost forever. Hope the arrest should have brought peace, but healing was not as simple as seeing handcuffs on the man who had haunted our lives for years. Even after the news spread that Jack had finally been taken into custody in Mexico, I found myself waking up in the middle of the night, checking windows, doors, and security cameras before I could fall asleep again. Fear had become a habit. It had lived with us for so long that my mind didn't know how to exist without it. Still, little by little, life started pushing its way back into our home. Emma threw herself into preparing for the school musical, spending evenings practicing songs in her room while Tyler chased a soccer ball around the backyard. For the first time in years, I could hear my children laughing without immediately wondering whether someone was watching them from the shadows. The months leading up to Jack's extradition were filled with preparations. Prosecutors from multiple states worked together, gathering evidence from every victim who had stepped forward. Sarah became one of the most important witnesses, and so did several women from our support network. The more investigators uncovered, the darker the picture became. They found years of files documenting his obsession with control. There were records of victims he had stalked, private information he had collected, photographs, schedules, and detailed plans showing how he manipulated people around him. Even seasoned investigators were disturbed by the scale of what they found. Jack had spent years building a network of fear, and now that network was finally being exposed to the light. One evening, While I was helping Emma finish homework at the kitchen table, she suddenly looked up from her notebook and asked a question I had been dreading for years. "Mom, what exactly did he do?" The room went silent. My husband stopped loading the dishwasher and looked toward me. I knew this day would come eventually. Emma was older now. She had lived through enough to know there was more to the story than we had told her. I took a deep breath and explained only what her therapist and I had agreed was appropriate. I told her that before she was born, a man had hurt me in a terrible way and had spent years refusing to accept responsibility for his actions. I explained that everything we had done was to keep her safe. Emma listened quietly, tears forming in her eyes. Then she reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You protected me," she whispered. "You always protected me." Hearing those words broke something inside me. For years I had questioned every decision, wondering if I had done enough. In that moment, I finally felt like maybe I had. As the trial approached, media attention began to grow. Reporters wanted interviews. News outlets covered the story because investigators had linked Jack to victims across several states and even internationally. Some journalists tried contacting us directly, but our lawyer handled everything. We had spent too many years being pulled into chaos to allow strangers to profit from our pain. The only thing that mattered now was making sure Jack could never hurt another family again. Sarah felt the same way. Together, we helped several new victims connect with counselors and legal resources. What started as a small support group had grown into something much larger. Survivors who once felt completely alone were finding each other and realizing they didn't have to fight by themselves anymore. Then came the day we had waited for. Jack was extradited back to the United States. The news broke early in the morning. I watched the footage on television, seeing him escorted off a plane surrounded by federal agents. For a moment, the image didn't feel real. This was the man who had dominated our lives for years. The man who had stalked my daughter, manipulated my mother, destroyed families, and spread fear wherever he went. Yet there he was, looking smaller than I remembered, older, tired, human. It struck me then that the power I had always imagined him possessing had never truly existed. His power came from fear, and fear was finally slipping away. The trial was now only weeks away, and for the first time since I was 16 years old, I felt something I hadn't experienced in a very long time. The morning of the trial arrived with gray clouds hanging low over the city, matching the heaviness in my chest. Even though Jack was finally behind bars, I barely slept the night before. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror for a long time, staring at my reflection. The woman looking back at me wasn't the frightened 16-year-old girl whose life had been shattered years ago. She wasn't the young mother desperately trying to protect her daughter. She wasn't the terrified victim constantly looking over her shoulder. She was a survivor, and today she was finally going to face the man who had spent years trying to destroy her. The courthouse was packed. Reporters waited outside behind barriers, cameras pointed toward every entrance. Federal agents stood near the doors while families of victims quietly filled the benches inside the courtroom. When I walked through those doors with my husband beside me, I immediately spotted Sarah sitting several rows ahead. She gave me a small nod of encouragement. Around her were women from our support group, women whose lives had been touched by the same nightmare. Some I had only met online, yet seeing them there made me feel stronger. For years, Jack had isolated us. Now we stood together. When Jack entered the courtroom, every conversation stopped. For a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my own heartbeat. He looked older than I remembered. The confidence he once carried was gone. His shoulders were slumped and his eyes avoided the crowd. But despite everything, the sight of him still made my stomach twist. My husband squeezed my hand beneath the table. I looked away and focused on the judge entering the courtroom. The trial had finally begun. Over the next several days, prosecutors presented evidence that seemed endless. They showed records of stalking, harassment campaigns, anonymous gifts, fake social media accounts, surveillance photographs, forged credentials, witness statements, financial records, and communications between Jack and his accomplices. Every piece of evidence painted the same picture. This wasn't a misunderstood man seeking redemption. This was a predator who had spent years obsessively controlling and terrorizing women and children. The jury watched in silence as victims took turns describing what he had done to their lives. Some cried, some shook with anger, others spoke with remarkable calm. Each story added another layer to the truth. When it was my turn to testify, the courtroom seemed impossibly quiet. I walked to the witness stand and sat down. The prosecutor asked me to tell my story. At first, my voice trembled, but as I continued, something changed. Years of pain poured out. I spoke about what happened when I was 16. I spoke about my mother's refusal to believe me. I spoke about Emma, the gifts, the stalking, the fake counselor, the threats, and the years of fear. I spoke about all the birthdays, school plays, and family moments that had been overshadowed by Jack's obsession. By the time I finished, there were tears in many eyes throughout the courtroom. Even some jurors looked visibly emotional. Then came the defense's cross-examination. They tried to paint me as paranoid. They suggested I had exaggerated events. They implied I had misunderstood harmless actions. But years earlier, those questions might have shaken me. Not anymore. Every claim they made was met with evidence. Every attempt to undermine me collapsed under facts. By the time I stepped down from the stand, I felt lighter than I had in years. The most unexpected moment came when the judge allowed Emma's written statement to be read aloud. The courtroom fell silent as the words of my daughter echoed through the room. She wrote about growing up surrounded by fear she didn't fully understand. She wrote about watching her mother protect her every single day. She wrote about wanting to live a normal life without constantly looking over her shoulder. The final line left the room completely silent. My mom spent my whole life protecting me. Today, I hope the court protects her. Even the judge paused before continuing. 3 weeks later, the verdict arrived. The courtroom was overflowing when the jury returned. I sat between my husband and Sarah, barely breathing. The foreperson stood and began reading the verdicts one by one. Guilty, guilty, guilty. Count after count. Every major charge resulted in conviction. By the time the final verdict was read, Jack's face had gone pale. For the first time since I had known him, he looked powerless. The sentencing hearing took place a month later. The judge spoke for nearly 20 minutes before announcing the punishment. She described Jack's actions as calculated, manipulative, and extraordinarily harmful. She spoke about the lasting trauma inflicted on multiple families. Then she handed down a sentence that ensured he would spend the majority of the rest of his life behind bars. When the gavel struck, I closed my eyes. It was over, not completely. The scars would remain, the memories would remain, but the fear no longer controlled our future. That evening, my family gathered at home. There was no grand celebration, no party, no dramatic moment. Just pizza around the kitchen table, Tyler talking about baseball practice, Emma laughing about something that happened at school, and my husband smiling as he listened to them. It was ordinary. And that was exactly what made it beautiful. Years later, when people ask me what victory felt like, I don't think about courtrooms or verdicts. I think about that night. I think about my daughter laughing freely. I think about my son growing up without fear. I think about the community that stood beside us when everything seemed hopeless. Most of all, I think about the girl I used to be, the 16-year-old who refused to stay silent when everyone wanted her to. She saved us all.